All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to begin session 4, Impacts on California Vegetation and Their Connections. You can see on the slide some of the indicators that have been highlighted in the previous report, and I know that our moderator, James Thorne, is going to speak to that. Just a little bit about our moderator. Dr. Thorne is a landscape ecologist who focuses on climate change, biogeography, conservation, and regional planning. He focuses on applied research and regional planning in California. Dr. Thorne has developed historical maps of vegetation distribution patterns, forest dynamic studies, species distribution models, and downscaled climate and hydroclimatic maps. Welcome, Dr. Thorne, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Orit, and welcome everybody to the session on impacts of California vegetation and their connections. I'm going to take a few minutes for introductory remarks. I'm quite interested in the connection between science and policy, as Dave Ackerley so nicely pointed us to, and also to practice. And that's one of the reasons that I'm excited to participate with OEHHA's initiatives on these climate indicators, because they, in effect, are the empirical measures that give us the motivation and the justification for looking at future management questions and policy questions. A few things that I've done that are related to implementation at that phase. I worked with Caltrans for about 10 years to develop regional advanced mitigation planning. So how do we bring the types of concerns that we may be alerted to through the OEHHA work to actual practice on the ground of the implementation of projects? Another project that I enjoyed working on was the US California gap analysis, developing the first existing vegetation map for California, published back in 1998 with Frank Davis. And ever since then, I seem to have been in and out of the world of vegetation. And so it's a great honor to present the group today. As Orit showed on the slide, in the previous edition of the Climate Indicators report, the vegetation section had quite a few components, 7 components. It documented the drought and the mortality event of 127 million trees. It tied increasing temperatures to increasing area burned in wildfires. It documented upslope retreat of the Ponderosa Belt across a 300-kilometer front in the western side of the Sierra Nevada. One of our presenters, Ann Kelly, included information on vegetation shifts uphill in the Santa Rosa Mountains, changes in the proportion of oaks and pines, as Professor Ackerley pointed to, also densification of subalpine forests in their density with more small trees, and a nod to agricultural dynamics with an analysis looking at earlier maturation of walnuts and some prune species with increasing temperature. So those are topics, some of which will be talked about or related to today, but today's session is going to broaden our perspective considerably, as well as deepen understanding on a few of these individual components. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker. We have 4 speakers today. Ann Kelly. Dr. Ann Kelly is with the Cal State University Desert Studies Center. She has degrees in physics, environmental science, and earth system science, most recently from UC Irvine. And she's worked in many places, on Catalina Island, in the Canyonland country in Utah, up on the north slope of Alaska. But now she's coming to you from a place that if you've never been, you really haven't lived. That would be Zzyzx, the CSU Desert Study Center over east of Barstow in the Mojave Desert. So Anne, thank you so much for coming to this and presenting.
All right, thanks, Jim. And thank you all for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk about the desert because I feel like it's we're often forgotten. And let me see if I can share my screen here. All right. So yeah, again, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak on California desert vegetation. So I am based at the Cal State University's Desert Study Center at Zzyzx in the Mojave National Preserve. We're a large field station for education and research related to California desert issues. And I want to acknowledge that our center is located within Chemehuevi territory, and we wish to thank the Chemehuevi and other tribes for stewardship of these lands for hundreds of generations. So California hosts three major desert biomes, the Great Basin, the Mojave, and the Colorado Desert, which is a subset of the Sonoran Desert. The Great Basin is characterized by high elevation, sagebrush scrub, and very cold winters. In addition to its kind of famous sagebrush, its other famous plant is the ancient bristlecone pine. The Mojave Desert is probably California's most iconic and is represented in popular imagination by the Joshua tree. The Mojave Desert is unique for North American deserts because it's not only hot, but it receives almost no summer rain. So the inhabitants of the Mojave must be very well adapted to these especially harsh conditions. The Colorado Desert in southeastern California is mostly low elevation with especially hot summers, but this desert receives about half of its annual rainfall in late summer, so that they do get some relief for its flora and fauna during the hottest months. California deserts make up approximately 40% of California's land area, but only about 4% of the human population. All of these deserts are characterized by pretty intense topography. So they all have high mountains surrounded by low valleys. This variety of local climates presents both opportunities and challenges for desert biota. So the Sky Islands are the cooler, wetter refugia on mountaintops. They provide milder climates and microhabitats for animals and plant life. However, the hotter and drier lowlands in between can function as barriers for movement, gene flow, and migration, or vice versa. The mountaintops may provide a barrier for the heat-dwelling plants and animals. So this topography has made these deserts extremely biodiverse through genetic isolation in these sky islands and valleys. This isolation also makes the local biodiversity vulnerable to climate change, with few pathways to follow more favorable climates. So before we talk about the effects of climate change on desert vegetation, let's review what climate change will actually look like in California deserts. And before we dive into that, I want to discuss the ways that we talk about climate, especially averages versus extremes. Deserts live and die on feast and famine. Average years are very rare. Average annual rain temperatures in the Mojave Desert are around 70 degrees, which sounds quite pleasant, but absolutely no one who lives out here cares about that. It's scorching summer heat and the icy winters that determine what lives and dies here. Average rain years are also almost a useless number. Most years are dry, but every once in a while we get a good year, and a good year out here means a series of Pacific storms arrives every week or two that bring gentle rains throughout the winter that germinate seeds and then nourish young plants into establishment. So the point I'm trying to impress, and this is true for all of California, but especially the desert, is that it's the extremes of heat, cold, drought, and flood that really determine the inhabitants of our ecosystems, or rather who doesn't survive. So given all that, let's look at projected climate change. The Southwest deserts are predicted to be a climate change hotspot with above average warming compared to the rest of the world. The already high summer heat is expected to increase by a few degrees in the next 30 years, and as much as 11 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. Rainfall predictions are uncertain, but rainfall is generally expected to decrease a bit on average. Again, on average. Heat alone induces faster drying of vegetation, causing what some call a climatic drought without any change in rainfall. But with hotter temperatures and less rain, vegetation is really going to suffer a double whammy of drought stress. And perhaps an even more alarming trend is the increase in heat waves. In the Zhao 2020 study, heat waves are defined as 3 or more days exceeding the 90th percentile of daily maximum temperatures. Lethal heat waves are expected to increase by 10 times by 2050. So that's just 30 years, and this is in California deserts. So the Mojave, for example, will go from about 15 heat waves per year now to 122 heat waves per year in 2050. And the heat waves will not just increase in frequency, but in duration by about a day. So that means that the majority of the year in 2050 will be considered a heat wave. Rainfall is also predicted to become more episodic, falling less frequently, but in larger storms. This trend is also dangerous for vegetation and other living things. This means longer drought periods between rains, and when the rains come, they fall so fast that they don't soak in, and the water just runs off into channels and can generate flash floods and erosion. So 2020 is a decent example of the climate changes to come. The winter, so last winter was a little cooler than average, but the summer was absolutely scorching. The blue line is the average temperature for the month of 2020 in 2020. And we see that August, September, and October are well above the heat wave threshold of the 90th percentile of temperature. That 90th percentile is represented by the light gray shading around the average. During this heat wave, the southern desert region experienced the longest dry spell on record, which for many of us is still ongoing to this day. Our region last experienced measurable rainfall in early April, so we have not seen a real drop of rain since then. Even for the Mojave Desert, more than 200 days without rain is well beyond a record breaker. So as a personal anecdote, we at our research station here this summer recorded about a month straight of 120-degree Fahrenheit highs. Native vegetation that lives around our pond with all the water that they could need at their roots were cooked, and some died. So temperatures at this level begin to destroy the biochemical processes in cells. So all but the very hardiest organisms suffer. So again, on to talking about veg finally. We see that climate changes we expect in desert regions are all pointing to increasingly difficult conditions for native vegetation. Higher temperatures, heat waves, droughts, and deluges, all of these conditions push our plants towards mortality. So the diagram on the right illustrates a study that I did in 2007 in the Santa Rosa Mountains on the south edge of the Coachella Valley. I repeated a vegetation survey from 30 years prior that went from the base of the mountain down in Palm Desert up to the top of the Santa Rosa Mountains at around 9,000 feet. Just a side note, the gentleman who did this survey in 1977, Jan Zabriskie, after he finished his stint there, he went on to become a deputy attorney general for the state of California and really worked on some important cases around climate change for the state. So I found that for these major species over those 30 years, the plants at the lowest, which are the hottest and driest elevations, died back. And the plants that were at their upper elevations within their range were thriving and filling in. So as a result, we saw an upward lean in the distribution of all the plants along the mountainside. And that lean corresponded to the warming and drying climate trend over those 30 years. So the plants were tracking quite closely the changing climate over that time. The plants were following the favorable climate conditions up the mountainside, and this was the first study of its kind to show multiple species across a region changing distribution as a result of a changing climate. But, you know, I hear often that it was described as seeing plants migrate uphill, and unfortunately they didn't. I would have loved to see them migrate uphill, but no new plants were found outside their historic range. So desert plants need a few good years to really establish new plants. And studies are showing that in California deserts, they're not getting the conditions they need for real recruitment. Additionally, the seeds themselves just don't move very far, and they really don't roll uphill. So as a result of increasing depth without increasing recruitment, we're seeing range contractions of many plant species across the desert region. This has been well documented, especially across several important plant species in Joshua Tree National Park. Unfortunately, there are a few large-scale studies tracking these effects across California more broadly, and especially the deserts remain understudied. Some secondary impacts of a changing climate on desert vegetation include opportunities for invasive species, as well as increasing fire frequency. The hotter climate with more episodic rain can especially favor invasive grasses. These grasses, even though they're puny and pretty short-lived, suck up soil water from native seedlings during the short and critical spring growing window. These grasses also take up physical space and shade out other seedlings. We see grasses like brome and schismus spreading widely across many parts of California deserts. These grasses grow a carpet where there would have been bare ground and shrubs spaced far apart. So these grasses then provide fine, continuous fuels to carry fire across landscapes that weren't adapted to fire. Desert plants are generally not adapted to survive fire, nor do they recover quickly after a fire. So pinyon pine or Joshua tree stands may take hundreds of years to recover, if ever. And grasses beget grasses after fire, so the cycle continues. Joshua Tree National Park is getting especially hit hard by this process. So let's look at the Joshua tree as a case study, desert vegetation and climate change. Joshua trees were recently granted a temporary endangered status by the state, and the battle over this listing will no doubt continue. Joshua trees' range is defined by winter snow. So they live in places that get regular snow in winter. With warming, that range will diminish. And in Joshua Tree National Park, their range will diminish by up to 90% as soon as 2050. Invasive grasses and increased fire frequency are destroying healthy stands around that region. And recruitment of new trees is decreasing. Its seed spreader, the giant ground sloth, has been extinct for 13,000 years. The sloth could carry seeds far outside their range, and that would provide opportunity to establish trees in more favorable areas. Without intensive mitigation, these trees will be nearly extinct in Joshua Tree National Park by 2100. Intensive mitigation would entail a great effort to collect seed and disperse it to milder climate refugia and higher elevations and wetter habitats, much like the giant ground sloth would have done. So just a quick counterexample to Joshua Tree National Park exists in the Mojave National Preserve, where I'm based now. We had the Dome Fire this summer, a 40,000 acre fire. It was started by natural causes in an intact high desert ecosystem. Lightning struck in a relatively lush Joshua Tree forest. It was full of native bunch grasses and other really beautiful, iconic Mojave species of cholla and yucca. And these native fuels were pretty continuous and pretty high fuel loads. The fire decimated 1.5 million Joshua trees without any cheatgrass or schismus to blame. However, the temperatures during the fire were record-setting 117 degrees with high winds. So during the fire, so it was very difficult to fight. So no doubt these heat wave conditions contributed to spreading the fire beyond what average conditions would have produced. Looking forward, if non-native species can be kept off the landscape that burned in the next few years, this area could recover to a really nice, diverse, native high desert ecosystem, albeit without many Joshua trees. So other threats compounding the effects of climate change on California deserts include major activities going on out here. So solar and wind development and their transmission lines scrape large swaths of desert. While the blading directly removes native vegetation, it also removes protective soil crusts. This bare soil is prone to erosion and becomes prime habitat for these invasive grasses. These soils are also worse at retaining precipitation. Groundwater pumping, including for these solar developments and mining and other activities, dries up springs and seeps that are wet habitats for many rare plant species, as well as being critical watering holes for animals. These water sources would be potential refugia for other species as climate continues to change. So losing these seeps and springs due to overpumping groundwater will take away potential habitat that could be mitigating the effects of climate change on California biodiversity. Also, increasing dispersed OHV recreation, like grazing and blading does, directly damages intact habitat and introduces non-native species and destroys protective soil crusts. Grazing alters ecosystem structure and can also increase the amount of invasive grasses present on a landscape. Then dust generated from all of these activities is shown to diminish native plant growth for hundreds of yards from the disturbed ground. The dust generated could ultimately alter the Rocky Mountain snowpack by darkening it. These darker snows melt early and cause earlier and larger pulses of the Colorado River, which is more difficult for water managers to handle. So ultimately affects our water resources back in California. So each of these activities can be practiced in ways that minimally impact ecosystems. And if we wish to preserve desert biodiversity, management consideration must be made for these impacts on these ecosystem conditions, not just now, but for 50 or 100 years from now. So are there signs of hope or resilience in California deserts in the face of this more extreme climate? The diverse topography of mountains and valleys provides small refugia in cool, wet places at higher elevations if the seeds can get there. And presuming the springs are still there and don't dry up. Desert species are tough. They will persist, but it is inevitable that there will be fewer individuals overall. And as we heard too from David Ackerley's talk, we'll probably see some reorganization of who becomes the winners in these different climate conditions. A hotter, drier climate simply cannot support the ecosystems as they currently exist on the landscape. Another point of hope is that wildlands in the desert are relatively contiguous compared to other regions. While there are roads and other disturbed lands, plants and especially animals are free to kind of move around. Though plants themselves aren't that good at moving, so active mitigation will be necessary for the conservation of important species. So assisted migration and invasive species control will be increasingly critical to maintain populations beyond isolated relics. One point of hope that I also really like is that drought kills brome, so that's cool. It's nice to see that the drought that is harming native species is also harming some of our more dangerous invasive species. So to conclude, the deserts are very tough, but what persists is already living on the margins of survivability. A warming and drying climate will push many plants beyond the brink, but the diversity of habitats and relatively undisturbed lands provide land managers with many opportunities to mitigate the effects of the changes that have already begun. While predictions are dire, there is hope for action to preserve the incredible biodiversity of California's deserts. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention today.
And thank you so much for your thoughtful presentation and for messages from the Mojave National Preserve and Zizix. Our next, continuing on the topic of, on the theme of hot talks, our next presenter, Professor Scott Stevens, is going to present a talk on forest fires in California, the role of climate change in management. Scott is one of the preeminent foresters in California, and he has supported many initiatives. He has a current ongoing important collaboration where he provides scientific support to the U.S. Forest Service, and in particular with Hugh Safford and the management side of the Forest Service. There's a really productive collaboration there. He's a professor of fire science and the director of the UC Center for Fire Research and Outreach, and he's the co-director of the UC Center for Forestry. He has extensive experience in analyzing prehistoric fires, current wildfires, as well as deep dives into California's forestry. So without that, welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. It's nice to virtually meet many of you. I know we're in an interesting time, but I'm happy to be here today. I'll share my screen to bring up my talk. And I hope this generates some discussion and some ideas because of so many things going on with forests in our state. And I just want to bring some information forward of some places that we actually see some potential for our forest able to work with changing climate and fire. My little picture here is actually a prescribed fire that I did at our UC Berkeley Blodgett Forest Research Station a couple of years ago. And here you could just see we're burning the understory, an area that hasn't been burned in probably 102 years. And subsequent changes of forest density, changes in species composition to more shade tolerant species. And we're bringing fire back into this system to try to get it to work. No doubt, climate change is impacting fire. I know sometimes we hear too much in the media about this. I'm afraid it's politicized to a point that I don't think is very useful. But here's just one example of how climate change is impacting fire in the northern Sierra Nevada. This is a graph of fire danger rating, something called the energy release component. Energy release component's been used by fire managers in the western US for decades to try to predict the ability of fires to get large. And you can see here from multiple stations of actual weather data, and then a projection off to the right where you see the dotted lines of what's happening to the energy release component since around 1980, and we see increases, and these are real. So we're seeing, yes, there's multiple lines of evidence that climate change is impacting fire in this state, and no doubt is going to continue. We know from the past this has happened already. Tom Sweatman's work on giant sequoia in California shows there were different fire regimes during the medieval warm epoch and also during the Little Ice Age. So we have records of this already, and no doubt, again, we're going to continue to see fire and climate change be connected. I wanted to spend just a moment about some data that we have for California forests in different parts and look at change. Of course, we know that if you take fire out, indigenous burning, lightning burning, inevitably you're going to change that ecosystem. And certainly if you harvest the largest trees like we've done in a lot of areas, that's also going to produce a large change. We were fortunate to find some large data sets in the Federal Archive in San Bruno. We found 4 of them. And these actually are large in the sense that they cover on the order of 10 to 20,000 hectares. So it's not like 10 hectares or some 20-acre plot. You're talking about a forest landscape evaluation inventory that just is really large, okay? 20,000, 25,000, 40,000 acres, thousands of trees inventoried in 1911. Why 1911 is interesting? Well, that really is before organized fire suppression begins. It certainly could be a period where we have reduction of cultural burning by tribes, but it is a snapshot of an ecosystem before harvesting. So we were able to actually go back to the same locations that were measured in 1911. You see the data here from 2013 and 1911. The lower left picture is actually a photograph taken in 1911. You can see that very open mixed conifer stand, not too much on the understory. On the right is actually a day I was out with the field crew measuring one of those sites in 2013. And you can see here a huge increase in tree density, lower tree diameters. And the data above tell us that. Tree density per acre for all trees above 6 inches goes from about 20 to 100. In this area of the Stanislaus in Yosemite National Park, the data come from an area that's actually both of those places, Yosemite and the Stanislaus. And the larger trees, a little bit surprising, we didn't see too much difference. And we see the pine proportion, or the proportion of species that are more drought tolerant and fire tolerant, go down. So this is pretty telling. I think sometimes when we look at these data, we don't realize just how much forests have changed. They've changed really remarkably because of our management history in the last 100 years. What about some places where we can get some information that maybe showing that there is some hope for forest resilience, at least in the near to medium term? Yosemite National Park, one of my favorite places, probably a lot of your places. Down here at the bottom is the Illilouette Creek Basin. Right there is Yosemite Valley. And the Illilouette Creek is pretty much just southeast of Half Dome. It's an area where the national park, to their credit, have been allowing lightning fire to burn pretty much unabated since about 1972. Pretty big area, 15,000 hectare watershed. And when we look at this area, it's remarkable. These two pictures to the right are actually inside the Illilouette Creek after some burning. And we've been working here now for about 20 years or more. And when we look at this photograph, this is actually just a picture of the different fires. Each different fire is a different color. Looks like a jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? We'll talk about that jigsaw puzzle in a moment, but that's just the whole sequence of burning that have happened in Illilouette Creek over the last several decades. Here's a picture of one of the fires that actually burned, 2001 Hoover fire, lightning ignited. And you can see this is upper elevation mixed conifer forest. So we're talking about red fir, white fir, lodgepole pine, Jeffrey pine, montane meadows, and montane chaparral. But here's a fire that burned in 2001, got fairly large in the Illilouette Creek Basin. And when we look about fire patterns, this is something that Brandon Collins has done some work on, a colleague of mine. And what we see here are polygons of, again, fires. So these are actual fires that are recorded just from a GIS database. So we know these from 1972 on. And we have several different fires depicted by color of white, gray. And then we have this darker perimeter of another fire that actually burns in that vicinity. And the thing I want to draw your attention to is, so when this fire hits the previous one, then the previous fire burned 7 years ago. Look at that. It actually goes out along the perimeter. There's no suppression here. This is a natural fire regime. So we see evidence of really limiting, self-limiting behavior in this system. There's a little enclave here with 5. That just means that little area burned 5 years previously. When this fire burned around it, it didn't burn the enclave because, again, it just burned so few years ago. So we call these limited fires. They're limited because fuel conditions are such that very difficult for those fires to burn into those areas because they burned previously just a few years ago. Over here to the right is just the opposite. Here we see other fires, and we have another one here with dark black, and we see 30, 23, 24, 13. These are the years previous to this fire. So after, a number of years, a couple of decades, 13 years to 30 years, the new fire burns right over the top. So fuels have increased, of course, through succession and plant dynamics. So yeah, and we find out statistically there's a 9-year threshold. So right around 9 or 10 years, if a fire intersects another one that burned previously at that interval or earlier, fire goes out on its own in vast majority of cases. And then when we get over about 10 years, they reburn. Kind of remarkable. Can you think of that in California? If we could get into a time machine and go back to so many places, at least in mixed conifer or conifer forest, and just look at how that dynamic used to happen. Here we're looking at just at lightning fire, and there's no doubt indigenous burning was also part of this as well. What about some outcomes to this? What's happened here? So from 1974 to 2004, we had data from remotely sensed data, and we calculate a burn severity index from Landsat data. It's been used now a great deal in forests because if you top kill a tree with fire, it doesn't resprout the conifers we have, so you basically get a dead tree. So this is a measurement of chlorophyll abundance. The thing about the Illilouette Creek, which is remarkable, you see these 3 stacked graphs, 74 to 83, 84 to 93, 94 to 2004. And they're basically partitioned into different fire severity classes: unchanged, low, moderate severity, high severity. And when we do an analysis of this time series, we find out that it's been stable over time. And this is somewhat kind of remarkable because, the National Park Service used to be just as good at putting fires out as the National Forest Service. In fact, they actually practiced full fire suppression and fire exclusion all the way up until 1968 when the policy changed. So this particular area, Illilouette Creek, just like Yosemite, has gone through 100 years of fire suppression. Fires come back, the first big one, 1974, the Star King fire. And then since then, fire has been reintroduced. And even with that, we see a stability of fire severity distribution. We don't see an increase that's actually certainly tied to climate change. And this work has been updated recently by a Ph.D. student, Katya, in Berkeley, and we actually now have another whole 10 years on this, and we still see relatively stable conditions. We're not seeing increases in burn severity in this area as fire operates in this landscape. Another student, Gabrielle, did some really interesting work. The picture to the left is actually a 1970 air photo that was stitched together, black and white. And this is the condition after 100 years of fire exclusion and suppression, just before the lightning fire regime was brought back in 1972, and then that first big fire in 1974. Look at that thing. That is wall-to-wall green. The green is basically forest. And you just see, you know, good evidence of how the forest is infilled, densification. And over to the right, 2012 is the same area after those fires have come in and burned and shaped that land. And we see wet meadows increase by 200%, dry meadows increase by 200, shrublands by 30, and forest decreased by 22%. That's not forest getting reduced density. That's actually reduction of forest to a different type of land, forest to shrub, forest to grass. So another remarkable change of how fire has shaped that land. Here's something about water. Water is so important in California. What we find is the runoff coefficient inside Illilouette Creek has actually been stable or slightly increased from 1974 to the present compared to the previous several decades. Those watersheds that are in purple there that have had no fire all simply decreased. We also know the soil water storage is up, and we saw less tree mortality in Illilouette Creek during the severe drought we just had. And then Katya just had a paper accepted that showed where she tried to look forward the next 50 years with climate change and warming, and these processes held. Remarkable in some ways. So again, another example of how a watershed could actually adapt and deal with climate change. Next few minutes, I know I want to go a little different place. One of my favorite places, the Sierra San Pedro Martier in Mexico. About 13,000 hectares, California floristic province, 2,700 meters. It's in the Peninsular Mountains. The Peninsular Mountains go right through the international border from San Diego down into northern Baja. Jeffrey pine mixed conifer, very similar to forest in the Lake Tahoe Basin, Eastern Sierra. Suppression begins in 1970, no harvesting really at all down here. Here's a place, the little red dot or the red square. This shows you where the Sierra San Pedro Martier is on the Peninsular Mountain Range. You can drive there in about 6 hours from San Diego. It's a national park. If you ever want to see this place, I encourage you to go. It's pretty amazing. I've been going down there about 25 years now. Here's a picture of the upper plateau. And this is very typical forest structure in the Sierra San Pedro Martier. A lot of Jeffrey pine here. There's also white fir, sugar pine, incense cedar, lodgepole, and quaking aspen, let alone the understory species. So this is what the Martier kind of looks like today. And what about drought and wildfire? Well, it turned out that we had a terrible drought from 99 to 2002 in Southern California mountains. Maybe you remember that. That was really a big event. There was a House of Representatives hearing on that. I spoke at it. It was a huge event for Southern California. Lake Arrowhead, tens of millions of trees died in that area, the San Bernardino National Forest. The same drought happened in the Sierra San Pedro Martier. By the crow flies, it's only about 120 miles south, 130 miles south. So we had the drought from 99, 2002, and then a wildfire burns in the Sierra San Pedro Martier. So the next year, we've been working in there for a number of years. We found that even after the 4 years of severe drought and a wildfire, only 20% of the trees died in the area we were researching. 80% lived. And pine actually became more dominant afterwards. It's not surprising because it's more tolerant of both fire and temperature. The fire was patchy, directly linked to heterogeneity of forest conditions, something we need to create in our state. Too much homogenization of our forests in terms of fuels, canopy cover, tree density. And every time I go down to the Sierra San Pedro Martier, I was just down there last summer again. We remeasured this very site, and there's a paper now in review on it. Every time I go down there, it gives me hope. That place has got the most resilient forest I've ever seen in my life. And it just gives me hope that what maybe some things that California forest might be able to do. Here's a picture. So the picture to the lower left, the left side, is actually an area that did burn in the 2003 wildfire that I took a picture last year in 2019. And there's that same picture I showed you a moment ago from the Stanislaus Yosemite inventory, 1911. You look at the data, forest density of these two places are almost identical. And we have two other very large data sets from the Southern Cascades and also the Southern Sierra that show similar densities. The Martier, again, just shows what a forest probably was like in California. Very different, open conditions. Every time I go to work down there, I got to bring a sun hat. That place has got moderate shade at best. It's just a lot of open area that actually has been sculpted by fire, drought, insects, climate change. Severity patterns. So Hugh Safford and some colleagues, Hiram from Mexico, did some work on severity patterns in the Sierras and Pigeon Martier. So this is that same remotely sensed data that I mentioned before. Get down to the bottom, average patch size of high severity, about 3 hectares. The largest, 11 hectares. 11 hectare high severity patch, holy Toledo, is that a good deal? Some of our high severity patches in our forest today, tens of thousands of hectares. Here in the Martier, you're looking at 12, 15, 5 hectares, very small. Overall severity of high in this whole sequence from 84 to 2010, 3% high severity fire from remotely sensed data. Fuels are more important than weather in the Sierras and Pigeon Martier, is what my colleagues wrote about in this paper. So here's the last slide. California frequent fire forests have changed a lot from suppression and harvesting, and they're burning at larger scales and higher severity today. We see that 2020 has been another sad example. Creek fire, so many fires, and North Complex fire. Climate change is no doubt a factor, it's absolutely a factor, but I would argue that fire and fuels and forest structure is more important, at least right now. In some ways, this is good news. This is good news because we can take actions today to help conserve our forests. Prescribed burning, indigenous burning. I know we're going to have a speaker about this topic coming up soon. Restoration thinning, wildfire management in remote areas. All these things could begin to help us change the trajectory of our forest ecosystems. So we can manage to reduce the vulnerabilities of our forest from wildfire, drought, bark beetles, increased temperatures. And I agree fully with David Ackley and others that there are going to be some changes in vegetation. We are going to see some of these conifer forests transition to things like oak hardwoods and such as that. That's going to happen. But I also believe that if we can get this restoration program going at large scale, that we could really make a difference to conserving the forests of this state and all the values they give to us, so many. I say the next 1 to 2 decades, absolutely critical in California. If we don't change trajectory and reduce the vulnerabilities of these systems, climate change, fire, insects, drought is all going to change it right in front of our eyes. I just say there's opportunity to maybe have some influence on this trajectory if we work decisively. I'm optimistic, but I'm also a little worried. I've been doing this now for about 30 years, and I've never seen the state so engaged in this topic in my career, so I applaud that. Federal government, frankly, hasn't done much in the last 4 years. We got a new president-elect. We'll see what happens with that. I'm a little hopeful. So I think there is will to do some of this work, but I just think it's something we need to do just in essence because we really have vulnerabilities that have really come forward in the last 100 years. And with that, I'll thank a few folks and thank you very much.
Scott, that's a great talk. Thank you so much. Very deep view on fire in our coniferous forests and the chance to use natural return intervals to rebalance these ecosystems. Geographically, we started in the Mojave and we moved to the Sierras and the transverse ranges with a quick jump down into Baja. And we're going to go further north now and to get a perspective from Native peoples who've been around for thousands of years. And I'd like to recognize Shawn, Bourque, and Daniel Sarna-Wojcicki, hopefully I got that, who are going to be presenting perspective from the Karuk Reservation, the Karuk area in Northern California. Their talk is on impacts of climate change on tribal agroecosystems and cultural foods and fibers in Karuk Aboriginal Territory. And Dan is going to give this talk. He's a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management at UC Berkeley. And he's been working with the Karuk Department of Natural Resources on projects related to climate change and agroecosystem resilience and elk ecology since about 2009. His research uses community-engaged interdisciplinary methods to address issues related to climate change, ecosystem rehabilitation, watershed management, and food access. So welcome, and thank you for your time.
Hey, thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate it. Thank you also to the hosts and the facilitators, the moderators, and my fellow panelists for some really fascinating, although slightly alarming, I must say, but nevertheless inspiring talks over the past couple of days, and especially for all of the very critical work that you all are doing in the climate space. I'm looking forward to tackling some of these issues with you all. I am not Karuk, I'm not a tribal member, but I have had the great fortune of being able to work and learn with the Karuk Department of Natural Resources since 2009. I've been engaged in ecosystem restoration and cultural revitalization initiatives through the Karuk UC Berkeley Collaborative, which is a consortium of researchers who are working with the tribe on community engaged projects. I really appreciated the remarks yesterday of Secretary Blumenfeld and Chairman Lopez when they were talking about breathing life back into science and reconnecting it to communities and to place. I think that's what a lot of my fellow presenters over the last couple of days are trying to accomplish, and that's definitely what we're trying to do through the Karuk Berkeley Collaborative. Today we'll be presenting on some of the Karuk tribe's climate initiatives. Unfortunately, my colleague Shawn Bourque had an emergency come up, and so he can't make it today. The Karuk tribe is a federally recognized tribe. They consist of about 4,000 members. They're the second largest tribe in California. Most tribal members live in the towns of Happy Camp, Wairika, and Orleans. The Karuk's Aboriginal Territory is not technically a reservation, but it is a recognized Aboriginal territory. It's that red outlined section you can see in the middle part of the Klamath Basin. These are some of the most biologically diverse and ecologically unique lands in the state.
Dan, we're not seeing your slides.
How about now?
No. I'm sorry, I didn't realize if you had, okay, screenshot coming. Yes, now we see the PowerPoint.
All right, excellent, thank you. I'm sorry about that. So there's the Aboriginal territory that I was just referring to. We were going to share a video clip to highlight some of the voices of the leaders in the community, but the audio was a little bit jarbled. So we're going to share some of these links in the Slack channel so that you can hear directly from community members about some of the initiatives that they're working on. So today, the Karuk tribe is really on the front lines of climate change, not just in terms of ecological and social vulnerability, but also through their visionary leadership in climate change research, monitoring, and adaptation. As many of my Karuk colleagues remind me consistently, the Karuk people have been adapting to climate change and climate variability for millennia, so they have much to teach about social and ecological resilience. Today, since this is the vegetation impacts panel, we're going to be focusing mostly on impacts to cultural plants, that is, species that are managed and used for food, such as tan or black oak acorns and huckleberries, or plants that are used for materials, medicinal purposes, or ceremonial regalia. And we'll go over some of the observed and projected climate change impacts to cultural plants and agroecosystems in Karuk territory, and also impacts to the Karuk community's relationship with these plants and ecosystems. We'll talk a bit about some of the responses that the Karuk tribe is taking to climate change, including the Karuk Climate Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Plan, which is led by Kari Norgard from University of Oregon, and the Karuk Agroecosystem Resilience Initiative, which is being led by Dr. Jennifer Sauerwein at UC Berkeley. And that project is setting up long-term research plots in Karuk territory and active tribal management areas to look both at the short-term ecosystem responses to fuels treatments, thinning, and prescribed burning, and also to look at the long-term impacts of climate change on cultural species. And the goal of that is really to look at how to increase the resilience of cultural plants and habitats to climate stressors. So in a survey that was published 2019 by Jennifer Sauerwein and colleagues of over 700 tribal households in the Klamath Basin, they found extremely high rates of food insecurity. 92% of tribal households are technically food insecure. That means running out of food, having to skip meals, running out of money to buy food, and 52% of tribal households are considered to be experiencing very low levels of food security. About 64% of households rely on some form of food assistance, but the community is still very much connected to the landscape and to cultural plants and cultural food species. But the survey also showed that about 70% of tribal households have identified climate change as a significant barrier to having enough cultural foods. The Climate Vulnerability Report outlined some of the myriad physical, mental, and social impacts that climate change is posing to the community related to species decline, food insecurity, and the disruption of cultural practices. I really appreciated Dr. Goggins' comments yesterday about some of the intersecting issues that climate change brings up for tribes, this cascade of impacts from climate change impacting ecosystems and cultural plants, and this has impacts on cultural practices, which in turn impacts physical health, mental health, tribal livelihoods, and food security. So there's a lot at stake for tribes and for the Karuk tribe in particular when it comes to climate change. I think it's also important to note, as has been alluded to by many of my fellow presenters, that this high vulnerability to climate change is in many ways also compounded and intensified by the legacy of resource extraction and mismanagement, fire suppression, and just the cumulative ecosystem and water quality degradation over the past couple hundred years. So what we're seeing in interviews and focus groups with cultural practitioners is that they're already reporting changes that they're noticing in terms of the timing of plant phenology, and that affects their ability to harvest cultural species. For example, willow roots and stems, which are used for basketry, depend on regular winter flood scouring for exposing roots and recruiting seedlings and saplings and producing new growth with straight shoots. And that's just not happening for cultural practitioners. Hazel has been apparently budding earlier and causing a shorter harvesting window for practitioners. Tan oak acorns and mushrooms are kind of unpredictably producing and fruiting in these boom and bust cycles every 2 to 4 years. This year in particular, we're seeing madrone, beargrass, and fern showing signs of severe drought stress, even more so than 2015. We've seen extreme summer heat waves really speed up fruiting and flowering in species such as trailing blackberry, huckleberry, gooseberry, redbud, and willow. Sap is running earlier in alderbark, which is used for dyeing basketry material. Geophyte bulbs for species such as blue dicks are smaller and don't propagate as well, and species that are more shade tolerant, moisture loving, such as Pacific yew, are becoming desiccated in areas that are where the canopy is opening up more. So the Karuk community and landscape are already experiencing climate change, and this is already having impacts on cultural practices, mental and physical health of the community. Given everything that we've been seeing over the past couple of days, these effects are only going to intensify over the coming decades. I won't spend too much time on the projected climate impacts, but the Climate Adaptation Report did some downscale modeling for the Karuk Territory, kind of tracks what we've been seeing in other regions. In general, it's going to get a lot hotter, on average 8 degrees across the territory. The interior regions are going to experience much more, that much more. We're going to see longer, warmer summers with more extreme heat days. In terms of precipitation, annual precipitation is actually projected to go up a little bit, but likely will be more variable and delivered in more shorter, intense storm bursts within a shorter wet season. We're projecting that stream flows in the dry season will likely decline. Peak flows in the winter will likely increase. Overall, reduced soil moisture conditions in the summer months by about 2 inches. And in terms of the snowpack, we're seeing some pretty drastic projections there. 37 to 65% of the snowpack will be lost by mid-century and 73 to 90% by the century's end. In terms of wildfire, again, tracking what we've been hearing, longer fire season, an increase in wildfire frequency and severity, and an expansion of the area susceptible to wildfire. So the Karuk tribe is taking some proactive steps to address this. Their climate adaptation plan was published in 2019, led by Kari Norgard from University of Oregon and Bill Tripp, who's the director of Karuk Department of Natural Resources. This adaptation plan focuses on 22 culturally significant species across 7 habitat management zones. Here's some examples of those. And so for these species, it details specific observed and projected impacts, as well as management and interventions and potential adaptations for both short-term acute emergency situations and also some longer-term restoration recommendations that will increase and enhance ecosystem resilience. The report also makes some governance and policy recommendations for supporting Karuk sovereignty and ecocultural revitalization, and then also recommendations to expand Karuk climate monitoring and research capacities. So the Karuk Agroecosystem Resilience Initiative in many ways comes out of both the Karuk's food security and food sovereignty work and also their climate work as well. The goal of the Agroecosystem Resilience Initiative is to work with DNR staff and also cultural practitioners and community members and research ecologists at UC Berkeley and US Forest Service to study in depth some of the links between climate change and cultural foods. This project includes 7 objectives, everything from field research and plot-based research, doing some remote sensing and archival research on land cover change. We're partnering with schools and youth groups and doing some community outreach and workshops. And we're also developing a citizen science mobile application to be used by cultural practitioners and the community members who are out there on the landscape actively gathering and observing culturally significant plants. So the main focus of the field research is this agroecosystem condition assessment, where we set up acre-sized research plots in active tribal management areas. These are areas that are being managed by the tribe in partnership with the Forest Service, CAL FIRE, and local NGOs. They're doing thinning, prescribed burning, manual and mechanical thinning, and habitat restoration in these areas. And so we're conducting baseline vegetation surveys to look at the current distribution, abundance, diversity, and the cultural use quality of focal species. And basically we're trying to put in place monitoring protocols and set up these plots as kind of living laboratories that the tribe can use to both study the response to some of these forest management treatments and also look at the long-term climate impacts to cultural species. We're doing a long-term land use land cover change using historical aerial imagery and contemporary aerial imagery and other archival resources to look at how forest ecosystems are changing over time and in response to climate and management events. And then we're also doing, as I mentioned before, some drone surveys of our plots. We're collecting voucher specimens of culturally significant species for the Karuk and the UC herbaria. We're also looking at historical voucher specimens to look at species changes in species distribution over time. One really important component of this project is working with local school groups and K-12 classes and tribal managers on climate education and curriculum development and also community workshops. So the goal of all of this over the next couple of years, we'll be pulling all of this field and archival research together and working with Karuk staff, cultural practitioners, and community members to develop agroecosystem resilience indicators for each of our plots that are specific both to the focal species found in those plots and also to the group and communities of resource users that are the stewards of those areas. The idea here is to blend Indigenous knowledge and best available science into climate monitoring protocols that are tailored to these sites so that they can be studied and managed by a small group of tribal land stewards who are really connected to those places and care about them and are likely to manage and study them going forward. At the end of the project, we'll be collectively making management recommendations to tribal and federal land managers for treatments that will increase the resilience of cultural food, fiber, medicinal, and regalia species and associated habitats to climate change, as well as to support and enhance cultural relationships with these agroecosystems at multiple scales. So we're still in the early stages of analyzing our baseline data and our first round of seasonal surveys, and we're working with the community to fine-tune these protocols. Over the next year, we'll be establishing new research plots focused on the fire footprints of the Salmon River Fire and the Slater Fire, and Happy Camp to look at responses to high severity wildfire of cultural plants. Also continuing to work with youth groups and the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership to develop monitoring protocols to look at the response of cultural plants to management treatments in the WKRP areas. We're going to be rolling out the Citizen Science Climate app and hopefully getting a lot of input from community members in that. Continuing collaborations with universities. We're working with Berkeley, Stanford, Davis, Humboldt State, Oregon State, University of Oregon, University of Washington, and others, as well as state and federal groups. And of course, the Karuk tribe is engaged in some very large-scale progressive ecosystem restoration activities, such as dam removal, off-channel habitat management, large-scale fire management, and wildlife habitat rehabilitation. And so they're going to continue to move that work ahead. They're really a leader in that space, in that part of the state. So if you are interested in collaborating or supporting the Karuk Tribe Department of Natural Resources, I'd be happy to follow up and put you in touch with my colleagues and answer any questions. Again, I really appreciate all of your work, and I appreciate the opportunity to be involved in this conference. I want to say a special thank you to my team, Jennifer Sauerwein, Lisa Hillman, Kathy McCovey, Vicki Preston, Megan Musioki, Frank Lake, Karuk Tribe Department of Natural Resources, and our funders at USDA. Thank you all. Really appreciate this opportunity.
Dan, that's a wonderful review and report from the North Coast. Thank you so much for taking the time to bring us up to speed and up to date with the exciting initiatives that are going on over there on the Klamath. We've now made a trip to the north, and we are going to come back to the Central Valley and other agricultural zones and hear from somebody who's sitting in the Sierra foothills. That somebody is Emeritus Professor Louise Jackson from the Department of Land, Air, Water Resources here at UC Davis. She has degrees in biology and botany, and in her career as a professor, she's influenced and educated many, many people in the realm of ecology, agroecology, agriculture, tying people to their food, to nature. And so without further ado, Louise, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to your talk on how does climate change impact California agriculture and vice versa.
Okay, I'm just trying to, can you see my screen? Am I sharing it?
Not yet.
Okay.
Now we're on.
Great. Thanks, Jim, for that very nice introduction. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I really appreciate being part of this exciting conference and seeing the depth and breadth that's going on in research and climate change right now. I was given a fairly provocative title, and I'm going to focus on this question relevant to this title, and that is, how can California agriculture adapt to climate change and also reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Of course, that's to contribute to the issues of climate change that we've been hearing so much about. What I'll be doing is discussing a framework for addressing this question. And I'm going to start by just briefly discussing some of the climate vulnerabilities, not the detailed climate portrayals that we've seen, but just mention that California produces 400 commodities, $50 billion of cash receipts, 25 million acres of cropland, and more if we consider grazing lands. And in terms of drivers of agricultural change, California's legacy really is that there have been many dynamic changes in crop and livestock distribution through the state through time. And that's a lot because there's ongoing innovation going on all the time. It's hard to even keep track
of the new markets, the labor solutions, the water systems, the transition to organic ag, and now to COVID. So I guess the hope might be that because of that legacy, that we're going to have the ability to cope with the gradual changes and extreme events that are in our future. I'm going to go into detail on those. We've heard so much so far in this conference. But what I do want to say is that there's another implication besides just food production and environmental quality in agriculture, and that's that if we don't see climate change adaptation on cropland and rangeland, we're going to see more urban conversion, as was already mentioned by David Ackerley. Ag lands have much lower greenhouse gas emissions than urban lands. So if we can conserve farmland and rely on more urban infill development, we'll be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help meet California's goals for greenhouse gas mitigation. So here are definitions of adaptation and mitigation from the IPCC, adaptation being tackling the causes of vulnerability and mitigation being interventions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the IPCC in these reports goes on to say that no single option is sufficient by itself, but it also has this very intriguing point here that I'm going to focus on in the talk. And that's that effective implementation depends on policies and cooperation at all scales and can be enhanced through integrated responses that link mitigation and adaptation with other societal objectives. Right now in California, agriculture and forestry represent 8% of California's greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we'd like to see that reduced by interventions that reduce carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane emissions from agriculture. But we also need incredible adaptation if we're not going to see those lands converted to lands that are involved in either industrial uses or greater transportation like urban sprawl. So how do we do that? How do we engage the ag community in focusing on adaptation and mitigation? It's often a very conservative community. It's already somewhat strapped and stretched. My own family has been ranchers for 4 generations. The 5th generation is coming on board as managers. We don't have a lot of confidence that that will continue. But moreover, we're already stretched so much with the things like the drought, labor shortages. It's hard to imagine exactly how we can engage people who are entrenched in mainstream conventional agriculture. So there are 2 programs that I want to talk about that I think have been really effective in building consensus on agriculture and climate change over lots of different kinds of stakeholders in the agricultural community. One is the Healthy Soils Program run by California Department of Food and Agriculture, which is geared towards innovative farm and land management practices for increasing soil organic matter with environmental benefits. So this little diagram tells a very interesting story about the program. You can see that there's some aspects that are related to adaptation, improving plant health and yields, increasing water infiltration and retention from the increase in soil organic matter, also a sequester of carbons, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But there's other co-benefits, such as reducing sediment erosion that might come from using cover crops, improved water and air quality from greater infiltration capacity, or using hedgerows or buffer strips that not only have environmental consequences for a better nutrient absorption, but also for biological diversity and wild habitat. So there's something about combining adaptation mitigation with a set of environmental benefits that is appealing to stakeholders. And likewise, the natural and working lands, I think, has an interesting angle, and that's that agriculture and rangeland are included in this whole grouping of different kinds of ecosystems. What so that they're then perceived as having some of the same goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and conserve and restore and manage ecosystems for their greatest potential. And actually, I think that most farmers and ranchers feel very positive that their land and presence has value for society beyond just food production. They see themselves as stewards of the land, even when they get caught in binds that aren't necessarily as effective as they might be for stewardship. So what's ahead for California agriculture? That's a really tough question, and I won't be able to answer, but I thought it would be good to talk about a very typical type of scenario for agriculture in the Central Valley and what the vulnerabilities might be. This is a simple landscape. It's been graded. It has only a few crops, orchards and annual crops, a lot of fallow land. The fallow land's usually because growers are waiting to plant annuals till the weather's the correct state or the markets are ready for their annual crops. The reality is these lands receive a lot of inputs, very intensive agriculture, water, fertilizers, pesticides, fossil fuel uses for tillage, largely monocultures. It's dependent on a very sophisticated water system that's a little bit in peril, as we heard earlier in the conference, as well as extraction of groundwater when those supplies become more scarce. The ramifications is that we see a lot of pollution, loss of soil quality, and other aspects of environmental health, and issues for farm worker health and safety. Most mainstream growers just have to focus on immediate production goals rather than ecosystem functions. They have to stay in business. And so we're up against a dilemma that could really affect California agriculture in the long term. What I've done here is propose 3 themes for thinking about how to sustain California agriculture under climate change. And the reason why I picked these themes, I mean, there could have been so many, I'm leaving so many important possibilities out, but they all somehow address vegetation, which of course is the theme of this session. And I think they all have the potential for adaptation and mitigation to climate change, as well as other environmental co-benefits, so that there are multi-benefit strategies that can result from them. And I just want to insert this little statement about indicators. One idea would be is looking for particular topics for indicators that examine the progress in achieving certain goals that these themes are geared towards. So agrobiodiversity is defined by the United Nations FAO as a variety and variability of all different kinds of organisms that are used directly or indirectly for food and agriculture. Water resilience is described by California Department of Water Resources as helping communities prepare for disruptions to withstand and recover from shocks and to adapt and grow from these experiences. And California Department of Food and Agriculture says the protection of agriculture for farmland conservation, it's the protection of agricultural lands and its water supply is essential to food security and supporting numerous other social and environmental benefits. So what I'm going to do is talk about each one of these types, these themes for possible interventions. This is a range according to a spatial scale from topics related to genotypes, to agroecosystems, and to landscapes. So starting with genotypes, we need plant breeding for traits such as heat tolerance, for pollination, for fruit quality, so that crops can produce effectively in their environment. And this isn't just an issue of production, it's also an issue of efficient use of resources. If poorly adapted crops are grown, water and nitrogen applications won't be efficiently used, and there'll be a greater propensity for nitrous oxide emissions. Nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas that occurs under semi-anaerobic conditions. Breeding for root systems, say deep root system, to improve nitrogen and water uptake, can also adapt the plant to shortages and actually can cool the plant during heat waves, as well as address the nitrous oxide emissions question. There's talk of low methane emitting heat tolerant cows. So this breeding program progress is, I think, progressing quite rapidly compared to 10 years ago. It's becoming a real issue in California. At the ecosystem level, a fair amount of initiatives have to do with soil. More complex soil food webs will improve carbon and nitrogen cycling. Here's some pictures of the kinds of creatures you get to see looking at the microscope at soil. So for example, if cover crops and compost are used in a cropping system, having a more complex soil food web will keep more of those nutrients in the soil cycling to meet plant demand than a more depauperate soil food web. Rotations in cover crops are important to keep production going through the whole year, less fallow periods. And the residues that they produce will be important for increasing soil carbon stocks and nitrogen retention. In marginal lands along field edges, hedgerows can be grown for their wood and soil carbon stocks and other functions, such as habitat for beneficial insects, for pollinators, and for wildlife. Moving to the landscape scale, there's quite a bit of ecological evidence that agricultural landscapes with diverse types of ecosystems have more resilience. The idea is that there's site-specific management to match the plant community or crop to landscape features. So for example, animals might graze on hillier terrain, the best soils might be used for crops, and there's restoration of riparian vegetation and its carbon stocks in stream corridors. The other idea is that there's a mix, that when there's a mix of farm types rather than monocultures, there's essentially what's called more insurance value. There's a better chance that some things are going to work out in the case of uncertain climate events. So again, one of the big issues here is how to engage the buy-in of mainstream farmers. There's plenty of evidence now that these types of practices work well in California, and a lot of the work that's been done has been in participatory research with innovative farmers, say farmers in organic production or doing regenerative agriculture. And as far as indicators, I think one of the things that we're missing is, what do mainstream farmers really think about climate change and the possibility for interventions? The second topic is water resilience, and here I've arranged them on a temporal scale, looking at short-term versus long-term intervention. The short-term ones being now or a short time from now, and long-terms might be, say, mid-century. Not real time for scales, but just an attempt to frame them. And it's undoubtedly a reality that we're going to be seeing less water intensive crops, either because of conservation of water with existing crops or switches to different crops. And we'll see reduced irrigation acreage as well. One of the drivers for this is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which requires basin recharge by 2040. Along with that are innovative ideas for capturing local runoff in agricultural landscapes and agricultural aquifer recharge. For example, it's being shown that alfalfa is pretty tolerant to temporary flooding that could be conducted when it's not in its highest growth period to recharge the soils beneath it. 1 out of every 5 acres in the Central Valley is projected to go idle by 2040. And right now, say during the 2012-2016 drought, idled land didn't have much use, but that's something we have to work on with some of those agrobiodiversity practices, for example, so that we just don't have bare land that can be sources of pests and greenhouse gas emissions. There's undoubtedly going to be new water projects to deal with issues such as subsidence, new canals to compensate for the less use of groundwater, and the flashy hydrology from more rain and large storms. That's what we heard about yesterday in one of the sessions, that we're not going to see the evenness of rainfall that we are typically experiencing over the past few decades. In the long term, the expectation would be that we have to overhaul our aging storage and flood control systems. These were largely built 50 years ago and are in need of repair. We'll see new crops and livestock for more variable and shorter growing season. Land, if it's not going to be urbanized, has to provide income to farmers and ranchers from other purposes, such as carbon storage, ecological services, and solar. The fluctuation in groundwater that we will probably expect to see, especially mid-century, is detrimental to water quality, say due to arsenic, and there have to be provisions made for farm workers and the local communities to deal with that. Similarly, there will have to be support for these communities when they lose ag employment in droughts. So these are interventions that are being spelled out in several different publications that I've listed below. And what I've noticed is that they are pretty much geared towards adaptation and environmental benefits. We're seeing less on mitigation. And in fact, the massive changes that are required here makes it very difficult to even think about the greenhouse gas emissions story and how it's also compensated by hydropower in the Sierra. It's a really big question. The third topic is farmland conservation. Right now, loss of farm and grazing land in California averages 50,000 acres per year, and it's mainly due to urbanization. Unfortunately, prime farmland has decreased the most. That's because the small communities in agriculture have typically been placed or settled in prime farmland. Urban conversion of farmland increases greenhouse gas emissions by about 70 times. And that's largely due to higher vehicle miles traveled. Now, I just want to put a pointer out there, is that number that I keep seeing used around was determined by my research group about 10 years ago. It was done for Yolo County, which is a very rural county with small towns and cities. And maybe this is already happening, but I think it needs to be done in more types of agricultural settings, like where there might be more urban sprawl, and done with more sophisticated methods than we did it. What's exciting is there's a lot of comprehensive land use planning that utilizing local and statewide policies and funding in some communities, in some jurisdictions. For example, looking at trade-offs between infill urban growth and farmland conservation. And what's interesting as I look through some of these different projects is that a theme is the multi-benefit approaches that come to both landowners and communities from open space. Local food, greenhouse gas mitigation, flood protection, recreation, wildlife habitat conservation, new revenue streams. And one of the most dynamic places where this is occurring is Santa Clara County. And the Santa Clara County Open Space Authority has made really huge progress in conserving lands in the south part of the county for both grassland, oak woodland, and agricultural production. These are pictures of Santa Clara County through time. You can see San Francisco Bay in the background of the 1936 photo, with orchards, vegetable crops, pasture, and the pictures taken from the grassland perspective. Then moving through 1960, where a huge rate of progress was made in creating subdivisions and shopping centers till 2014, when we see a pretty much ubiquitous urban environment. I grew up here in the 1950s, and it has some resemblance to 1936 with small farms where you could buy vegetables and fruit crops right next to your home. And actually, to be honest, as a personal note, is that one of the reasons why I've in the past gotten so involved with farmland conservation was just watching how fast that transitioned in this really unusually beautiful agricultural valley. In California, we're seeing tremendous activity on initiatives for agriculture and climate change. I've mentioned some of them before. There's others listed here. And at the bottom is the Act on Climate and Protection of California's Public Lands that a couple of the earlier speakers, including Wade Crowfoot, explained to us as a result of the executive order by Governor Newsom really recently. I think that these are really interesting opportunities for indicators. Some of them have projections of goals that they would like to see through time, especially the water resilience portfolio and the Natural and Working Lands Climate Change Implementation Plan. So tracking some of those goals and seeing how they affect both adaptation and greenhouse gas mitigation. Another idea might be to look at the so-called climate smart programs, healthy soils, manure management, SWEEP for water efficiency and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and look at the grants that have been funded through time and just track how people's priorities have changed, even in the few years of these projects. I've also, just as an exercise, tried to think of other indicators of agricultural responses to climate change, and most of these are too complex for the purpose of the document that you're going to be producing this year. But I was actually challenging myself to think about how could you look at adaptation, mitigation, and environmental co-benefits, social benefits as well. One might be to track the agricultural community's interest in climate solutions that are based on biodiversity or other types of interventions by compiling and classifying articles in trade journals, say Ag Alert, that's published weekly by the Farm Bureau, and look at the types of issues that farmers are interested in and what they need and want to learn about. Another might be to evaluate the severity and ramifications of an extreme event on a hard hit commodity, either flooding, wildfire, heat waves, and to track the production and value before the event, but also all the effort that's involved in just shifting to something new that may eventually, hopefully, lead to adaptation capacity and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We could examine the diversification of at the county level through time. For example, to show how species richness and evenness of crops have changed through the last few decades, and then estimate greenhouse gas emissions, say with very simple like tier 1 methods. And that would be to relate diversity to mitigation. We actually did something like this for Yolo County using the Shannon-Weaver Index and showed that through time, over the last few decades, species richness of crops decreased and even evenness increased. And that's because a few dominant crops occupied large acreages across the county. And of course, that's not so desirable when you're looking for good candidates for a changing climate. Another possibility might be try to track the changes in idled land and of restoration in a landscape prone to variable water deliveries. Spatially explicit remote sensing with modeling of changes in revegetation with time could be used. And one that is probably outlandish, but I think could be really interesting, is to identify some sentinel sites for an iconic California agricultural landscape and observe how adaptation and mitigation strategies affect ecosystem services, including, of course, crop production and value through time. One that might be particularly interesting might be Salinas Valley, which produces most of the nation's cool season vegetables. And it would be an opportunity to combine both biophysical and social strategies in that. So I just want to end with this slide that I showed in the beginning and mentioned that I do think that California is leading the way on how we look at multiple scales, multiple approaches to link mitigation, adaptation with other societal objectives. And in fact, this is something I think that's quite pertinent to the conference's themes of interconnectedness, that to achieve these greenhouse gas and climate adaptation goals that are directly related to climate change, we need the support of other disciplines as well to get the public buy-in. So thank you for listening. Thank you for inviting me. And thanks also to CalCAN, the California Climate and Agricultural Network, for their input on this presentation.
Thank you very much for a thoughtful and deep dive into California's agriculture that are lying there into adapt to climate change. I'd like to invite Daniel and Scott and Ann to come back on screen. We only have a few minutes of discussion for lunch hour. I see Maurice said, but Carmen, you hear my voice?
Just to let you know that your voice is a little bit garbled. We can't hear you very well. I'm not sure what's different.
I will leave and come back, and maybe Ann can take the first questions from the chat.
Yeah, so let's do that. We have about 10 minutes before the end of the session. And so, yeah, Ann, if you want to take, there were a couple of questions there at the top. I can help you if you need to identify those. They're at the top of the Q&A panel. And we'll see if we have time for more.
All right, well, the first one I see here is it's to Dr. Stevens on California wildfires being due to poor land management.
Sure, it's a question that's a good one. I think when we look at the history of different vegetation types, and I certainly just talked about frequent fire forests today, so we can have a different discussion about chaparral and other vegetation types. But I would say that if we look at forests that are adapted to frequent fire, which is a vast majority in California, that the legacy impacts of both fire suppression and exclusion and harvesting have set us up today for a very difficult fire problem. And I think that there are things you can do today to really make a difference. We heard indigenous burning. I didn't talk about restoration thinning at all in my talk. Manage wildfire, remote areas, certainly prescribed fire. So that's the good news. I think the good news is there really are things we could do today to really make a difference in that particular site. And not saying that climate change is not impacting it. It is. And we may see some transitions from forest to things like oak woodlands in some of these areas because of higher temperature. But I do think there really are enormous opportunities to really kind of change the trajectory of what's going on today. We should not be having things like the Creek Fire. We should not be having huge fires like the North Complex and those characteristics. The size of the fire never worries me. It's actually what's going on inside. What are the mortality patches? How big are they? How continuous are they? Those are the things. And the good news is we could actually mitigate that. So I hope I answered your question.
There was a question for Ann with regards to can you hand pull the invasives? And perhaps related to that, what are the, perhaps more relevantly, is there a balance that could be achieved between renewable energies in the desert and the biodiversity preservation. What's your perspective on that?
As far as invasive control, I think there's better and better research on that all the time. And, I think the simple answer is to leave as much undisturbed as possible. Disturbance itself just allows pathways for invasion. So preventing that is really the best way. But there are some techniques being discovered, but there's not a lot of great sort of techniques on a landscape scale right now that I know of. And then the other question about renewables development, that's a tough one. There are ways to do things like transmission lines and solar fields with less ground disturbance, but they're very expensive. And so that's really a social priority issue around, how we want to spend our resources. And, just like with the invasion question, less consumption would be a really good start to not require new developments. There's a lot of room left, I think, to prevent the need for those things in the first place. But yeah, it's not a question I can answer.
And there was one other one that came to me during your presentation. You mentioned the conditions for good recruitment and humans becoming giant ground sloths and dispersing jay trees, which I enjoy imagining myself doing. What are the conditions for good recruitment in the desert? Like, if you were going to do assisted migration, what would you be looking for?
That's a great question. Really, for the long-lived species out in the desert, things like even the uncharismatic species like blackbrush have a really hard time establishing, and it seems as though they need several years of good conditions. And generally what good conditions means, and this is true across California, is several years of good rainfall dispersed throughout the growing season, and mild temperatures without these extreme events that can kind of kill off young and vulnerable plants. So, in addition to perhaps providing assisted migration to more favorable areas, these seedlings may also require additional protection and watering or other measures to ensure establishment. It may be quite intensive in terms of intervention.
There's a couple of questions around fires and this current 2020 year. And I think I'd like to pitch the first piece of it to Dan. So Dan, I'm curious what the perspective of the Karuk tribe is with regards to the large fires that were on several sides of Karuk land. And then perhaps there's a question in the chat with regards to burn severity and perimeters, and whether there was any thought of trying to run wildfire into old fire scars, as we've heard from other places like the North Fire.
That's a great question. From everything I've heard about the Slater fire, this was the fire in Happy Camp that burned, I think it's about 100,000 acres, destroyed 200 homes, and killed 2 people. I think that fire started along a transmission line, although I think it's still being investigated. But it was an area that the Karuk tribe had planned some thinning and prescribed burning in, but the Forest Service never got around to doing those treatments. And so I have heard that the intensity and severity of that fire was in a large part due to the extreme fuel loading and high fuel conditions around that transmission line. So I do think that some preventative fire management work would have made that fire a lot less intense and severe, and there would have been a lot less damage. I think the salmon fire was a lightning ignition, and I believe that there were some pockets of high severity fire, but in general, it was much more driven by ground fuels, didn't reach the canopy in a lot of areas. And I think from what I've heard from people working on those fires is that it actually did some pretty good ecological work. And in response to the question about burning in fire perimeters, I've heard, at least from my Karuk colleagues, that it's important to get back into those fire footprints within about 3 to 5 years post-fire to do treatments. I'd love to hear Dr. Stevens' perspective on that, because I'm sure he's done some work on that as well.
I think I would agree with what you've said, Dan. You know, I do think that the places where you had more of a restoration fire this year, and in Santa Cruz County, you know, the CZU complex, we had fires in Napa County, coastal areas. You know, there are a lot of areas I think it was more restorative, and I think you hit it on the head that it really is an opportunity now to use those fires, as costly as they were, for houses lost, you know, lives lost, smoke impacts for the Bay Area, causing huge numbers of premature deaths reported in a Stanford study. But I think we use those things as a restoration, and getting back in, like you say, 3, 5, 7 years, the second fire really will set it up, because you've got this system that's been modified for so long. The first fire does a little bit of surface fill reduction, lateral fill reduction, heterogeneity creation. And then about 3 to 5, 7 years, some of that material that's been killed by the first fire starts coming down, gets on the ground. Get a second fire in there, you really are on now a trajectory of restoration. That second one is key. So when I talk to folks about this, sometimes I think they think I'm nuts, because I say things like, you know, this really is a beginning now to bring fire back. It really is an opportunity that we've never really had. It's much nicer to do prescribed burning, and I would say indigenous burning, but I'm not an indigenous burner. But if you have a mosaic out there to work against, if fuel ages and burn perimeters, that is an enhancement. So I would agree with you fully. I think if we don't get back into some of these sites in 5, 7, 7, 8 years, it's going to be a giant missed opportunity.
The concept of second helpings is what I prescribe to in most, also in dinner and drinks and those types of things. I'd like to get the last word to Louise. I know we're right up on time, but there's a couple of questions that were pitched to her in the chat. Are there any studies using mycorrhizae inoculations to improve soil health? And perhaps you could comment on our the focus on almonds with water intensivity.
Yes, there are studies on mycorrhizae. That was a topic in my lab up to the time I retired. And what's exciting is the research that we did in organic tomato systems. Mycorrhizae, fungicides are not good for mycorrhizae, being a fungus, but they showed that both nutrient absorption and water absorption were increased by mycorrhizae. The other question, say the other question again, Jim.
Oh, it says in the chat, why are we growing so many almond orchards when they are so water intensive?
Such a good question. Well, a lot of the lands that in almonds might have been in fruit crops before, perishable fresh market fruit crops. Almonds are a lot easier to manage. Labor issues are easier. Almonds are our #1 export crop in California. California exports 42% of the products that we grow. So there's a lot of reasons economically for almonds that keep farmers in business.
Before I hand it back to Orit, I have 2 very brief comments. The Slack channel is active, and I encourage everybody to add more questions there for our presenters. And I'd like to thank Scott, Dan, Louise, and you've been very generous, and you've provided great breadth and perspective for this session.